that we don't delay. Again, I'm going to go ahead and start. Okay. Bismillah. تفضل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله نستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي وقني شر نفسي وفلت لساني وأن أضل أضل أؤذل أؤذل بغير حق رب العالمين. وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Peace and blessings of God be upon you all. First of all, I really would like to thank all of the people connected with CTS for this wonderful gesture of hospitality and for affording me the opportunity to come and benefit not only from the company of so many beautiful and familiar faces and the opportunity to meet some new ones, but also for the opportunity it affords me to benefit from some of the intellectual and experiential capital that's in the room. I want to say that I was asked actually to come and speak about a book that I wrote entitled Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering. And I'm a little bit intimidated by that masterful presentation that Dr. Umar gave, and I worry that mine might be a little more academic. So I'll try to see what I can do along the way. But let me just say the following in the way of introducing my topic. One of the things that I think is important for us, particularly at this moment in our history, both as a community and as a country, is to gain a bit more familiarity with the very nature of theological discourse in Islam. I think that there's a real extent to which we as a country, and by the way, that's not just the non-Muslim community, because there are many Muslims who are just as affected by all the images and the stories and the narratives that are generated about Islam as are non-Muslims. And I think that sometimes what that can do is effectively what a French scholar by the name of Guy Debord once talked about. He talked about the phenomenon of actually having our capacity for genuine human encounter decreased, that we can lose our ability to genuinely encounter one another, to the point that I'm here, I'm present, I'm speaking to you, but you can't really hear me, you can't really understand me, because all of the images and stories that have been generated about me come between you and my words. And therefore, we're not really able to encounter one another. And I think that that's very problematic, because it sets up certain expectations, and sometimes those expectations are so very powerful that Muslims, especially in this post 9/11 world, feel a certain amount of coercion to try to speak in a context that won't so upset or violate those expectations. And what that can actually have the effect of doing is further perpetuating rather than diminishing misunderstanding. So I'm gonna try to break out of that and just give a little bit of an introduction in terms of how I want to frame this whole business of Islam and its theological discourse. I think that one of the things that it's very difficult for people to get about Islam in the modern world is just how pluralistic and just how comfortable with debate and difference of opinion Islam in its classical pre-modern guise was. And again, this is not only non-Muslims who are not so attuned to that reality, Muslims themselves. And so often the expectation is that if you're going to talk about something like Islamic theology, then we want to know, well, what is the Islamic theology? Whereas in point of fact, Islam was not some kind of dictatorial soliloquy where one voice spoke and dictated from on high what everybody else would be required to follow. Rather, Islam, both in terms of its law or Sharia and in terms of theology, was ultimately a negotiated construct. And part of that had to do with the very history of Islam in the world. Many of us today are used to thinking of Islam as this sort of predatorial entity that goes about the business of spreading itself through violence and coercion. That's a very common stereotype about Islam today. And quite frankly, some of the things that some Muslim communities in various parts of the world do today go a long way in confirming some of those stereotypes. But I think nonetheless we should not be blinded or too blindly caught in the moment that we imagine that what is today has always been. I'm sorry. That's all right. So, go ahead. Oh. Let me recover from that. Anyway. So we should not be overly caught up in the moment whereby we imagine that what is always was. Islam, in terms of the population of Muslims, not in terms of the political power of Islam, did not spread by coercion. In fact, most of what we consider to be the Muslim world today, the central lands of Islam, basically from Morocco all the way over to Iran or Afghanistan, and then further northeast, those are sort of the central lands of Islam today. The reality is, however, that even once Muslims were successful at acquiring political power, those societies, in terms of the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, the everyday citizen, remained predominantly non-Muslim for centuries. Places like Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Iran, these are places that did not become even simple majority Muslim for over 250 years. So that's, in fact, longer than the United States has been a country. Now, I say that not to dispel this notion so much of Islam spreading by force, as to alert you to the fact that if Islam, in terms of populations converting to the religion, is moving so slowly, you can imagine that how the religion itself is negotiated in terms of what a proper understanding of the religion is going to have to accommodate many different backgrounds, many different traditions, many different ethnic traditions, linguistic traditions, philosophical traditions, etc. And all of this goes into the early debates in theology that make up the overall construct of Muslim theology. And those debates did not result in some unanimous consensus across the board, which is to say, that was real? Okay. Tweetable. Man, all right. Okay, where was I? Okay. So the point that I'm trying to make is that when we talk about Islamic theology, we're not talking about one thing. We're not talking about a single articulation of how Muslims understand God and God's relationship to the world or the universe. All right? I came into this project a number of years ago, and the project itself began with a notion that always appeared to be quite salient to me, and that is that in the modern world, the greatest challenge to religion is not so much persecution as it is apathy born of irrelevance. That when religion loses its ability to address pressing issues of the day in a manner that resonates with a broad enough cross-section of people, when it loses that ability, there's no need to persecute religious people. You can sort of ignore them out of existence. Alongside that is the idea that in the modern world, the issue of theodicy reigns as one of the most pressing issues, not simply for Islam, but for religion, period. And by theodicy, I mean the issue of how do we reconcile the notion of there being a God who is all-powerful and all good on the one hand, with the presence of so much evil and suffering in the world on the other. And this is a question that really in many instances has the effect of either alienating people from religion or putting them in a place where they become more or less religiously agnostic. In a more specific American context, there is a particular version of the theodicy question that is even more pressing. And this is the whole question of black suffering. And my perception was, and quite frankly remains, and that's something we can talk about in the question and answer period, is that no religious vision or mission that intends to sustain itself and flourish in an American context will be able to do that without successfully addressing the issue of black suffering in the context of theodicy. And that is not at all to say that black suffering is somehow more or more important or more severe than other group sufferings. Other groups in America have suffered. Native Americans have suffered. Chinese, Jewish communities in America have suffered. All kinds of other groups have suffered. So I'm not engaging in any kind of oppression Olympics, as it were, who suffered most. But I do think that in the context of the broader American narrative, black suffering is the suffering that America, both officially and unofficially, remains most responsible for. I mean, that's just a part of the American narrative. And so no religion that wants to sustain itself and flourish in America can afford not to address effectively this issue of black suffering. Now, alongside that, I was brought face to face with a very concrete debate in black American Christianity that went back to the 1970s. In 1973, a theologian by the name of William R. Jones published a book entitled, "Is God a White Racist?" The title itself sounds a bit flamboyant, probably a product of the times. In reality, however, it was an extremely serious essay on this whole problem of black theodicy. Jones was, I think, a Baptist turned Unitarian. He was a theologian. He was teaching at Yale Divinity School. He was not some kind of fly-by-night theologian, a very serious scholar. And his book was aimed primarily not at whites, but in fact at an entity that came to be known as black theology. Jones addressed this book to black theologians, and his basic argument was the following: that black theologians, those theologians who had championed or produced this new theology called black theology, which was in a sense an attempt to give a Christian foundation and validation and legitimation to black power. That's what black theology was. He argued that they were so caught up in God talk that they were willing to privilege God talk and religious devotion over the prior necessity of actually addressing black suffering on the ground. And in point of fact, he argued that their theology failed to come to terms with the reality of black suffering. And not only did it fail to come to terms with it, it actually had a narcotizing effect on black Americans themselves. And this was part of Jones' critique of black theology. More specifically, his argument came down to the following: black theology had embraced traditional notions of omnipotence, divine omnipotence, i.e. the idea that God is all-powerful. It also embraced the notion of divine omnibenevolence, that God was all good, all just. Because this had been a part of traditional Christian theology that black theology had taken over. Jones, however, objected the following: if God is all-powerful, then nothing can come into existence outside of God's power. God exercises power over all things. If God exercises power over all things, God must have the ability to eradicate black suffering. If God chooses not to eradicate black suffering, and this is the assumption that we are left with, by the continued presence of black suffering, then either God intends to benefit blacks by this suffering, and that's why he doesn't eradicate it, or he intends to harm them by it. But if God intends to benefit blacks by this suffering, then Jones argued that that leads to the problem of quietism. Because if God is the one who sponsors this black suffering, and we assume that this black suffering is a benefit to blacks, then blacks have no choice then other than to accept that suffering, because to oppose that suffering would be to oppose God, because God sponsored it. On the other hand, if this suffering was not intended to benefit blacks, then it must have been for the purpose of harming them. And here's where the charge, or potential charge, of God being a white racist comes in. If God, on the other hand, is all good, and all good God must want to eradicate black suffering as an evil. If God does not eradicate it, it can only mean then, if he wants to eradicate it, that he can't. And if he can't, then God is what? He's not omnipotent. And we complete the circle. If he is omnipotent, then he must have the power to eradicate black suffering, but refuses to. And this raises the question again. Since God does not want to eradicate black suffering, is God a white racist? Now, Jones argued that as long as black theology retained this commitment to divine omnipotence and divine omnibenevolence, it was doomed either to encourage blacks into quietism, or it had to accept the idea that God was a white racist. All right? Now, I came into this project as part of an overall interest that I have based on where I think that we as a Muslim community are in this country. Because I began to ask the question, if this critique by Jones of black theology is a valid critique, and on the face of it, I think we have to admit that it at least has a semblance of validity. The question became for me then, how would that argument apply to Islam? And the reason why this question then arose was that Islam too had traditionally subscribed to various versions of traditional notions of omnipotence and omnibenevolence, right? We always hear Muslims saying, MashaAllahu kan, wa ma lam yasha, lam yakun. Whatever God wills occurs, and what he does not will, does not. All right? So my question became, how then would Islam respond to this critique by Jones? And part of my concern was that in the context of America, Muslims, in terms of their theological debates, were primarily still involved, or still, you might even want to say, hung up on sort of old world or even pre-modern debates. And this, I felt, was an issue that was coming down the pike, and given the population of blacks as Muslims in America, that Islam would eventually have to confront this issue. And here I go back to that whole business that I was making when I first started out. In some ways, the Muslim American community finds itself in a situation today that is quite analogous to the situation of the early Muslim community following the death of the Prophet Muhammad and the beginning of the spread of Islam into what became the Muslim world. They were for 2.5 centuries a numerical minority. We in America are a numerical minority. And yet, some of the foundational parameters of Muslim theology crystallized at a time when Muslims were a numerical minority. And that is because Muslims engaged the societies in which they lived. And this has always been a part of the Muslim intellectual legacy. Islam was never hermetically sealed. And we'll see some of this as we proceed. So this was sort of the impetus behind wanting to take this project on. And now that I have you here, I can say that my own approach to this issue was not so much to proffer what I believed would be the final answer.